Good, good morning, everyone. What we're going to be doing today is starting a brand new Sefer, Sefer of Daniel. Hopefully, everyone had a chance to get a copy of a Sefer Daniel. It's a relatively short Sefer. It's a unique Sefer because of all of the Sfarim in Tanakh. This is the only one where Aramaic is used not just to record documents like you'll find in Ezra, where Ezra is quoting from a document that was written in Aramaic and therefore he writes it in Aramaic. But this is actually a sefer. We're starting with the second chapter. We're going to find large segments of it written in Aramaic itself, which raises all sorts of questions among Chazal as to why that is the case. And more likely than not, the answer is because Sefer Daniel is a very unique kind of Sefer. It's a Sefer that really takes us into the midst of the galut, of the dispersion in Babylon and Bavel. It's one where we see a tension that exists between Judaism and other religions in a real sense. It is a also a sefer which will encounter things we normally don't encounter. For example, in this first parak, we're going to encounter Daniel standing up and not wanting to eat non-kosher food. If you think about it, we have a prohibition about non-kosher food, obviously in the Torah, but we don't find this kind of conversation taking place anywhere else than Daniel. So, in many ways, Daniel is a sefer that presents that real tension of the galut, not just Jews being persecuted, but Jews interacting. And the language of interaction was in Aramaic, and therefore it was also obviously in the language of Kasdi, of the Babylonian, but that language was Aramaic or a form of Aramaic, and that's why we still have it preserved in the Sefer itself. According to Chazal, the Sefer was written by the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, that body of 120 great sages who were really formed by Ezra and Nehemiah, that at the point when they returned to Eretz Yisrael, which is around the same time as the Sefer, we'll get to the timeline in a moment, they began to form this governing legislative body called the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And we all know that in modern times, the reason why there are 120 members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is they modeled it after the 120 members of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah and their eventual form. Rashi explains that this was written by Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Zerubbabel, Mordechai, and all of the other Chachamim. The Abarbanel has a much longer list. The Rambam has a longer list as well, and he includes among the authors also Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, people who are the subjects of much of this story. The book itself is divided into two sections. The first section is really a biography of Ezra, and that's chapters 1 through 6, where we call it the Sefer Hamasim, the story of Daniel and all of the events that occurred in his life. And then we have, once again, from Perek Zion to Perek Yud Bet, we will have the second piece, which is called Sefer HaChizyonot. Now, that's the book of the dreams. That already, in fact, some people who write about Sefer Daniel talk about that almost as an autobiographical portion of this book itself versus the first section of the book. The other pieces to remember is that Sefer Daniel is not located within the Nevi'im, and so even though I normally refer to this as our Navi Shir, we really are learning now Ketuvim. And it's an interesting discussion that takes place within the Gemara Megillah and Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, where we quote Daniel in one of his dreams in Perek Yud, where Daniel says, "V'raiti ani Daniel levadi et hamareh v'anashim asher hayu imi lo ra'u et hamareh." Daniel talks about seeing this vision, an awesome vision, and the people around him were not seeing the vision, but they did have this sense of fear that struck them at that moment. So the question there was, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, who were these people who were with him who didn't see? Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And the unusual thing is these are three prophets. How could they not see what was going on? And ultimately, the Gemara says, Inu adifa mine, that they were greater than Daniel in the sense that they were Nevi'im. And Daniel was not a Navi. Iu adif minayu, But Daniel was greater than them because he saw that vision and they weren't able to see the vision. So then Rashi goes ahead and Rashi explains there in the Gemara in Megillah and Daf Gimel Amud Aleph that the difference between Daniel and Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi is really they all had prophetic vision. Daniel sees these visions starting with chapter 7 and to the end of the Sefer. He had prophecy, but his prophecy was a prophecy that was a personal prophecy. It wasn't a prophecy that was, as Rashi quotes, "Shenit nab'uli Yisrael b'shlichuto shel makom," that the other prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, were prophesying on behalf of the Jewish people. This is the reason why Daniel was not considered a prophet. But it's still a little bit complicated because, right, okay, his book maybe shouldn't be considered one of the Nevi'im, but why isn't he a Navi? He did have prophecy, he is a Navi. And so the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim in the second Sefer in the 45th chapter writes that actually Daniel wasn't a Navi. Daniel's prophetic visions really weren't prophecy, they were Ruach HaKodesh, which is a step below Nevuah. And that's why he isn't a Navi, and that's why this book isn't considered part of the Nevi'im itself. With that introduction, I just want to deal also with a moment in terms of timelines. And in terms of timelines, just understand that I will share the screen of the timeline I sent. I'm sorry I didn't get a better picture of this page. It is actually coming from Rav Steinsaltz before his passing, was able to see a full publication of Tanakh. And this is the volume that's on Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. There is all of Tanakh, the Steinsaltz. There's also, came out several years ago, a Steinsaltz Chumash, which was very much designed to be in place of, let's say, a Hertz or a Stone Chumash. It hasn't taken off in the same sense as those Chumashim did. But in here, he puts in a chart. And what he wants to give you a concept of where pieces are. So we see the era of Daniel really is right here, and it's a little hard to see the shading. This is where Daniel plays a role. Okay, and if you remember, he is playing this role starting from right before the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and he continues with the capture of Bavel by the Medes, by Dariavish the Mede, and then continuing with Cyrus the Great of Persia, and past the era of Cyrus, and even into the era of Mordechai and Esther. He is, as Rav Steinsaltz points out, or his editors point out, we want to know who the Nevi'im were. So Yirmiyahu was a Navi. Then you had Daniel. To see if you notice the question mark on Daniel, because we're not really sure if he was a Navi or not. We see the leadership. We also see who the kings were in the leftmost column of that Daniel and others had to deal with. Nebuchadnezzar, who was 45 years, his son Avil Merodach, who was 23 years, Belshazzar, 3 years we encounter Cyrus the Persian, the great Cyrus the Great, who was here, then Achashverosh, who was the son of Dariavesh the Mede, etc. This is taking a position that is a classic position within Chazal. There is a lot of disagreement about this. And if you notice later on, then you have Ezra and Nehemiah coming back, okay, after the 70 years of Galut. And this disagreement, which if you notice, this whole black era, first you start the 70 years of exile, which goes till about here, a little bit lower, till about here. And then you have the 52 years of that era with the Persians, which really starts with here, the conquest, and all the way down to Ezra and Nehemiah's time in the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash until the capture in 333, 332 of Persia by the Greek Empire. Now, this 52 years is very, very complicated. And they actually, the editors are fair, and they write this one comment on the bottom. Ben ha-mechkar histori levin mesoret Chazal kayam par hamagia le-165 shanim. There is a disagreement between Chazal's chronology and the chronology of historians. It's 165 missing years. in those chronologies. Now, that is the subject of an entire shir unto itself. There is a very interesting book I have here at home called History and Conflict. And in the History and Conflict, it has almost 100 answers to how you respond to this disagreement of the 165 years. Rav Schwab, many years ago, actually wrote a famous article, which later in life he said was misunderstood, but Rav Schwab said that it was a calculated misunderstanding by Chazal. They didn't want people to have a sense of precision within history because they didn't want to have, and this is what he referred to as the Sod Daniel, the mystery of Daniel. They didn't want to have people have a clear understanding of timing of Mashiach. So any calculation you would make would be a calculation that is wrong. When I was in the yeshiva, Rabbi Mishkin followed the approach of Zev Yavitz in his history that says that it was a misreading, this 52 years, whose source is the Seder Olam Rabbah. Zev Yavitz says that it's a misreading of the Seder Olam Rabbah, and it is not, it's a question of Lifnei Habayit, what is referred to as the Lamed Lifnei. Is it before or is it in the presence of the Beit HaMikdash? And what we were always taught is that that Chazal, when they were writing hundreds of years later, the history of this era, unfortunately, they had a Masoret of people who were important, but they didn't have that knowledge of the history because that was never the focus of Chazal. And the Persian era was actually pretty much unknown until the discovery of the Behistun inscription, which was in the 1800s, and no one really understood what it was. And as a result, what we'll hear in Chazal is not necessarily the historical account. It is more what Chazal wanted us to learn from them. And so the 165 years is missing in this count. It is the reason that when you try doing if you try converting the secular date and the Jewish date, things get kind of messed up on the years, that 165 years. There are ways to resolve it. There are ways to just say, you can say either all the extremes. Chazal were wrong on their dates. The historians are wrong on their dates. There's something in the middle, and it is there. But in terms of the classic explanation of where Daniel falls in, Daniel is one of the people who is exiled at the time of Yehoiakim. He remains in exile for his entire life. He was a person, and we'll see, he was a person from a prominent family with great skill and great ability and a great sense of right and wrong. And Daniel plays this role for us that is very, very significant in terms of Jewish history. And so this is the timeline, and let's get into the Sefer itself.
Rabbi?
Yes.
On the right, with the Gimel, the Shin, and the Tzadi.
Right.
What are those numbers? Is that showing the 165 years, sort of?
No, those Gimels, those are the Hebrew dates. Okay, and the Arabic script are the dates of the BCE dates, of the secular dates.
I don't understand.
In other words,
use an example.
With the Gimel, Barry, to explain like this, we always refer to the fact that this is Tafshin Pei Aleph is our year, 57, right, 81. The reality is, if you take Tafshin Pei Aleph, you only have 781. What happened to the 5,000? So the real year is Hey Tafshin Pei Aleph, Hey with an abbreviation which stands for 5,000. And the counting we use is the abbreviated form, which in Hebrew is called Prat Katan. So this was let's say the top date there is 3,320 is that date up here. Okay. And that's the Jewish dates. The numbers before it, okay, you start having numbers where and if you notice there are two sets of numbers, and if you look at those two sets of numbers, you'll see that those are the distinctions between, we're really not sure what date it is because of the 165-year difference.
But wouldn't the difference between those numbers all the way down be the same difference? But it's not.
Well, we do know the difference is by the time we get to the Greek conquest, everyone agrees that it was in 333, 332, depending on the exact year, and it was actually used by Chazal that year. It was, and so those earlier years, it's like we jump. Some people will jump from 445 and go to 332. We don't know what's in the middle.
Okay, gotcha.
And that's the way it works. And it seems very, very strange in that, but that's the only way you work it. We know Chazal agreed 100% with the Greek conquest. And the reason they agreed it with it is because we actually use that date within Jewish documents. We nowadays use, the dates from Briat HaOlam, from creation. In the time of the Greeks and up until the Middle Ages, they would often date it from the Greek conquest of Persia and start zero from then. And so there was agreement on there. So that's why you'll have these different dates.
Rabbi,
Yes, Jim.
I'm a little. I just have a question. Was Daniel alive during the time of Ahasuerus?
Was Daniel alive during the time of Achashverosh? Yeah, he was alive during part of Achashverosh's life.
Okay, so so he had no. He was a known minister, correct? He was a respected minister.
According to Chazal, he was part of that story. Now, again, just to hedge a bit, okay, depending on how you use these dates, we're not sure exactly when the story of Purim occurred, because the story of Purim could have occurred. We know it was during the Persian era, but if it occurred much, much later, then we have more problematic. Then it may be that Daniel was not there.
Okay, because I was wondering if Daniel would have any influence on Ahasuerus, but that's
Right. So that is where it becomes interesting. Rashi in his explanation of who the author of the book was includes, and does as does the Abarbanel and as does the Rambam, that Mordechai was one of the authors of the book, was one of the co-authors of the book or the editors of the book.
You would have to get there.
Okay, so there was some level of interaction according to this chart you see. In other words, with this chart, if you can tell, and I apologize again for the copy, this is a little bit highlighted. It's the part of the box that I just highlighted. If you look, it has a little bit more shading to it to show you where Daniel was around during that period of time. So during the period of the time of the exile, and already in the period of the time where we begin to see the return. Okay, because Cyrus the Great is the one who issues the decree allowing the Jews to return to the land of Israel.
Rabbi,
Yes,
Ahasuerus was in Persia.
yes, Persia, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire.
Who did conquer the Babylonian as well. Okay.
Right. And so as a result, where exactly, while Ahasuerus's palace was not in Babel, it was in Susa or Shushan. Okay, this was part of these empires that took over. If you look on the left side, you'll see Belshazzar is the last. The person over here is the last of the Babylonian emperors or Babylonian kings, and then Cyrus the Persian comes in. Okay, and Cyrus the Persian is the person who is very significant. Achashverosh ben Daryavesh is taking the Mede Daryavesh, and remember there was more than one Daryavesh. Daryavesh is Darius. If in fact one of the challenges we have is in Chazal, we don't find one of the great emperors of the Persian Empire mentioned. Cambyses, Kambuzi isn't mentioned. So that's part of the whole question of the counting of the years. And I'm not doing that subject justice, but it is, I don't know, there are a lot of situations. What you'll find, for example, and this is a side note, and I'm a little off topic, and I apologize because I want to get into the Sefer. Koren is publishing a new textbook, a Jewish history textbook for high school students. It'll be out, I believe, for the new school year because the final date for revisions was Shavuot. I have a copy on my desk. And it deals with this, it starts around this time period of the Galut. And the first thing I did when I wanted, they asked me to review the book, is I jumped over to see how they dealt with the Persian Empire and how they dealt with these years. And they did a beautiful job of ignoring it. Because no matter what you write, someone's not going to be happy. And so that's the approach they took. There are others who deal with it head on. And again, I would refer any of you, if you want, there's this wonderful book. The author is Mitchell First, History and Conflict. And he has all of the different approaches, from the rejectionists to the complete exceptionists to the ones who are trying to find the middle ground between the two. Okay. Let's turn now, if we're okay, to the beginning of Sefer Daniel. To Pasuk Aleph in Sefer Daniel, and also I had the second handout for you, which will help us on the second pasuk as well. On the first pasuk as well. Bishnat Shalosh L'Malchut Yehoyakim. Now, if you remember, the end of Sefer Malachim, we had Yehoyakim, who was put in place by Paro Necho. You remember the two great empires were Egypt and Babylon. That Nebuchadnezzar was at battle with Egypt. When at one point Nebuchadnezzar was in the area of Eretz Yisrael, he suffered a defeat, at which point, if you recall, Yehoyakim rebelled against him, saw an opening, aligned himself with Egypt. Unfortunately, Egypt never came to the support of Israel. Yehoyakim, as a result, as the pasuk now says, Ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel Yerushalayim vayatzar aleh. Nebuchadnezzar then came and he placed a siege over Yerushalayim. Now, Yehoyakim was, and we talked about this, and based on the various psukim, whether it's in Yirmiyahu and Divrei Yamim and Melachim and here in Daniel, we ultimately know that Yehoyakim was taken captive. We know he died, but we're really not sure the circumstances of his death. And Yehoyakim, after he was taken away, then came in power Yehoyachin. Yehoyachin is also known as Yechoniah, as we refer to him in the Megillah, where either Mordechai or his ancestor was exiled at that time. Then after that came Tzidkiyahu, under whose rule the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed and the rest of the exile occurred. So we have now in the fourth year, and this is significant, the third year of Yehoyakim's rule, Nebuchadnezzar comes, he places a siege on Yerushalayim, Vayiten Hashem biyado et Yehoyakim melech Yehuda. And even though Nebuchadnezzar might have thought that he won the war, it was God who won the war. God caused Nebuchadnezzar to win. Umitzat klei beit Elokim, and also not only did he give over Yehoyakim, the king, but also some of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash. Ultimately, all of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash would be looted and pillaged later in the time of Nebuchadnezzar when Tzidkiyahu falls. Vayivi'em eretz Shinar Beit Elohav, and Nebuchadnezzar brought them back to Bavel, also known as Eretz Shinar, to the house of his gods. V'etakelim hevi, and also the utensils he brought, and he placed them in the Beit Otzar Elohav, in the treasury of his of the idol's house. Now there is a major problem, again with chronology, just of the first pasuk, not as big as the 165 years missing from the Persian era, but the problem really comes down to a contradiction. And I'm going to share the screen once again, and this was the second handout that I gave you for this year. And there in the pasuk it says, here in Daniel, the top paragraph is our parak from Daniel, that it was in the third year of Yehoyakim, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, came to Yerushalayim. The problem is in Yirmiyahu, in Perek Chafei, in the first pasuk, it says, Hadavar asher haya Yirmiyahu al kol am Yehuda. This is the prophecy that's going to be, that Yirmiyahu received regarding the nation in Yehuda. B'shana revi'it leYehoyakim ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda, which occurred in the fourth year of Yehoyakim's reign. He Hashana Rishonit Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Now again, we mentioned this during the Shiur in Melachim. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar is referred two different ways, Nebuchadrezzar and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadrezzar is actually closer to how he was referred to in Babylonian. But having said that, if you notice, this says the fourth year of Yoyakim was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, whereas Daniel says in the third year, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, came in a year earlier. So when did Nebuchadnezzar become the king? And so as a result of that, there are a number of different approaches that are taken. And I'm sharing with you three different approaches. The first is from Seder Olam Rabbah. Now again, Seder Olam Rabbah is the classic work of Chazal on history. It's the book that teaches us that Rivka was 3 years old when she brought all of the water for Eliezer. Okay, it's the book that gives us all of the ages and the chronologies. It is actually Tanaitic in origin. It was written by Rabbi Yossi. It's known as a Braita. It is on the status of those things of Tanaitic literature that wasn't included as a Mishnah, but just one step below it, the Braita. And there in Seder Olam Rabbah, he confronts, Rabbi Yossi deals with the issue, B'shnat shalosh l'malchut Yoyakim melech Yehuda, Ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel al Yerushalayim v'yitzar aleam, quoting our pasuk, Efshar lomar came. It says the Seder Olam Rabbah, is it possible to say it was in the third year? V'alohu melech b'shnat malach b'shnat arba leYoyakim. Did Nebuchadnezzar only become the king in the fourth year? Umad Talmud lomar b'shnat shalosh lo yakim. So what does it mean when it says in the third year? Ella shanat shalosh lemarado. Rather, what it means, it was the third year of his rebellion. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that when Bavel had a setback, Yoyakim had decided to realign himself and rely upon Egypt and to stop paying tribute to Bavel. That was his rebellion. We refer to his rebellion in Sefer Melachim. And so it was the third year of his rebellion. We know the rebellion went for 3 years, and that's when Nebuchadnezzar came on. So it wasn't the third year of his reign, but the way we would reinterpret that pasuk from Sefer Yirmiyahu, okay, or I'm sorry, the pasuk from Sefer Daniel is, it's the third year of his independence, of the independence of the monarchy of Yoyakim. That's the first answer. So true, Nebuchadnezzar became a king in Yoyakim's fourth reign, but later on, when Yoyakim rebelled, 3 years afterwards, Nebuchadnezzar came and placed the siege. Writes the Malbim, he says on the same pasuk, Bishnat shalosh cheshbon ze soter l'ma shekatav b'Yirmiyahu. This 3-year measure contradicts what's written in Yirmiyahu, B'shana revi'id lo Yakimi shana rishona Nebuchadnezzar, where there it says the fourth year of Yoyakim was Nebuchadnezzar's first year. Al Kain Piresh Chazal b'shnat shalosh l'mardo. And says the Malbim, that's where we find out what the Seder Olam Rabbah says. It was the third year of the rebellion. By Rabbi Avram ben Ezra Piresh, and the Ibn Ezra writes, B'sof shalosh shishnat arba Yoyakim. And he says, no, really, when he says the third year, he means 3 full years. Why? Because if you remember, monarchs, the way they measured the number of years that they were on the throne was not from the anniversary of their coronation, but for Jewish monarchs, from the first of Nisan. As he'll explain, V'yesh lomar sheYoyakim malach ba'adar. And he explains like this, Yoyakim became a king in the month of Adar. Umanulo b'Nisan shana achat. And when the first Rosh Chodesh Nisan came, he's now considered having ruled for 1 year, even though he was only 1 month. K'mo shekatav b'Rosh Hashanah, like you see in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah. Shemalchei Yisrael minisan maninan. Because we count the monarch's reign from a Nisan to a Nisan. Again, if Yoyakim became king a day before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, hits Rosh Chodesh Nisan, he's now into year 2 of his monarchy. V'im malach b'chavtet ba'adar, he says, and even if he began his reign in the 29th day of Adar, kevan shegia yom echad b'Nisan, now the next day happens, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, al talo shana. He's now considered a full year in reign. V'hakasdim, but the Babylonians, manu al talo shana rishona. No, they didn't use the Jewish method of counting monarchs. They still said he's in his first year. And as a result, what's happening here? That when we talk about the third year of Daniel, when in Sefer Daniel, this whole book is written from the perspective of exile. And in the perspective of exile, even though halachically we consider Yoakim in his fourth year, Nebuchadnezzar, as far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned, he's still in his third year. This is not, he doesn't go for this in one day and then you're now in your second year. V'yesh od perush b'zeh kvar katafti b'zeh b'sefer Melachim. It says the Malbim, I'll give you one more explanation, which I wrote about in Melachim. Ulefi perush harabi Avram ben Ezra, according to the Ibn Ezra, siper ki techef b'mloch Nebuchadnezzar bali Yerushalayim. Okay, what this basically means, according to the Ibn Ezra, unlike Seder Olam Rabbah says that Yoakim was a king for a while, then he rebelled, then Nebuchadnezzar came. According to this approach, as soon as Yehoiakim starts out as a monarch, along comes Nebuchadnezzar to Yerushalayim, because it has to be within the first few years of the reign. Okay, and even though many years went on in terms of the Matzor, the siege in the time of Tzidkiyahu. The third explanation to this is in the Ibn Ezra. Now, the Ibn Ezra's commentary on Sefer Daniel is very different. Normally, we're familiar with Ibn Ezra's commentary. The Ibn Ezra's commentary begins with his list of questions, and then has his answers. It goes along, according to the order of the text. However, when it comes to Sefer Daniel, the Ibn Ezra wrote a perush. His commentary is called Ma'anei HaYeshua. It's all about Mashiach. It follows the text, but at the same time, it has many, many digressions. Yeah, Yafa.
Ma'anei HaYeshua, is that a Barbanel?
Yeah, that's the Abarbanel. What is it?
Said Ibn Ezra.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the Abarbanel. I apologize. It's the Abarbanel's perush. Now, again, if you think about the Abarbanel's life himself, you begin to understand why he focused this way on Sefer Daniel. The Abarbanel was a person who suffered greatly at the hands of despotic monarchs, living his life in exile after having been exiled by Ferdinand and Isabella, despite all he had done for them. It helps shape a lot of who he was, which makes all of the sense in the world. His attitudes towards monarchy are as bad as they can possibly get, and we see that explained both in terms of the famous piece he has on the Migdal Bavel, where he attacks that sense of what was referred to, or what we think of as civilized society. When it comes to the question of monarchies, when it comes to Shmuel and appointing a king, and Shaul, all of these things we see, and also at the same time, the same kind of sense of needing of Mashiach, the idea of the Geula that's waiting for us and the wanting to extend it. So he writes, "V'nei b'hashlamat gimel shanim lemalchut Yoakim b'tchilat hashana hadalet harevit she hayta hashana rishona lemalchut Nebuchadnezzar k'divrei Yirmiyah alal Yerushalayim v'natan Hashem biyado et Yoakim." He says at the end of 3 years, the beginning of the fourth year, as we read in Yirmiyahu, is when Nebuchadnezzar came and attacked Yoakim, as it's written here in Sefer Daniel. And they took him off in chains, Bavela towards Bavel, like it's written in Divrei Yamim. And that's also when they took some of the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash. ודניאל חשש לשלוש השנים שלמים ולא חשש להתחלת השנה הרביעית. And Daniel in his calculation is looking for 12-month years. He's not looking for or complete years. He's not looking for small portions into the beginning of the fourth year. That's why Daniel says it was in the third year. He finished 3 years. And apparently it seems that Yoakim was enslaved to Nebuchadnezzar after he was in Babylonia. And then he took him back to Yerushalayim. Or after the conquest, Yoakim actually didn't go to Bavel. But he pleaded and he sought mercy from Nebuchadnezzar on the way when he was being taken in chains. And he agreed to be faithful, to be subservient to Nebuchadnezzar, and then he brought back to Yerushalayim. Ulechein amar b'divrei yamim, and that's why it says in divrei yamim, v'yasru b'nechushotaim lo licho bavela. That's why it says the terminology. We dealt with this in divrei and Malachim, that they chained him to take him to Bavel. V'lo amar v'yolichuhu bavela. It doesn't say they took him. They said to take him. Aval amar lo holicho bavela. It just says they wanted to take him. Ki haya b'da'ato lo holicho shema, because Nebuchadnezzar wanted to take Yoyakim to Bavel. V'chazar mira'ato v'shav Yoyakim liYerushalayim. And Yoyakim went back to Yerushalayim, v'amad gimel shanim eved leNebuchadnezzar. And then he was 3 years a servant to Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, the way the Abarbanel is building it up, that you have first, he was finished, he was in his 4th year, the beginning of the 4th year, when Nebuchadnezzar got him. 3 years he was back in Yerushalayim. And then he rebelled. Okay, and that's what's referred to in Sefer Malachim when he went back to Yerushalayim. That was 5 years. So it was 3 years first, then it was 3 years where he was back, then it was 5 years of rebellion. It was 11 years altogether. That's when the armies of Bavel, the Gidudei Aram and the Arameans, as is mentioned in Sefer Malachim, second time he was taken away. Umeit baderech Yerushalayim b'cherpa uvos, and there he died along the way in shame. Kedivrei Yirmiyahu schov v'hashlech mahala l'sharei Yerushalayim, like Yirmiyahu refers to, where he was dragged from the gates of Yerushalayim. Hineit ba'er, according to the Abarbanel, sheshnei pamim hugla Yoyakim v'dan. That twice Yoyakim was actually exiled. The first time in the beginning of the 4th year, the end of the 3rd year, and then after a rebellion, and Daniel was from that first group that was taken out. And the Abarbanel says, listen, you can't look at a single book of the Navi and get the entire picture. You have to take all of the books and try to put together this puzzle to be able to understand the total picture. And so what you end up having out of this story is that you understand that Nebuchadnezzar went ahead and he captured Jews at the same time of the battle he had with Yoyakim, whether it was one battle or 2 battles, whether it took place early in his monarchy or later in his monarchy. We're not 100% sure. We know Daniel went up earlier, according to the Abarbanel. We also know that at that point, he also captured some of the clay Beit Elokim, some of the utensils from the Beit HaMikdash. Reb Sajigon explains that some of those vessels that he took is referring specifically to the vessels from the Beit HaMikdash that ultimately ended up in Yerushalayim. And so we have that in, and I'm just looking for the text, we have a description of that actually in Sefer Ezra. And in Sefer Ezra, we talk about, and I'm just going to pull this up. Okay, excuse me 1 second. Just have to find how to get this in place. And in Sefer Ezra, in Perek Aleph, and I'm not sure, I'm not finding it. Excuse me 1 moment. In Sefer Ezra, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Chet, there it is. In Pasuk Chet, we read the following. When Cyrus the Great took over, this is again after the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and Cyrus is telling the Jews, you can go back to Israel and build your Beit HaMikdash. In Pasuk Chet it says, V'yotzi'em Koresh melech paras al yedei mitredat hagizbar, that Cyrus released through the office of his treasurer, okay, mitredat v'yisparem l'shashbatzar hanasil Yudan. He gave all of these things, and he gave an accounting to it to Shashbatzar, who was the head of the Jewish people in Bavel. Ve'ela misparam, and this is what he gave back from the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash. Agar telei zahav shloshim, there were 30 bowls. Agar Tilei Chesef Elef. Okay, there were 1,000 silver bowls. Machalafim Tisha Ve'esrim. There were 29 knives. If you remember, when a shoichet doesn't use a knife, he uses a chalaf. Okay, the same word is here. Kipporei Zahav Shloshim. There were another. These are smaller kinds of bowls. There were 30. There were 30 silver gold ones. Kaporei Chesef Mishnim. There were double bowls. Arba Me'ot Ve'asara 110. Kelim Achirim Elef. There were another 1,000 utensils. Kol Kelim LeZahav LeKesef Chameshet Alafim V'Arba Me'ot Hakol He'elash Hashpatzar. Im Ha'alot Hagolami Bavel Yerushalayim. So there were 5,400 different utensils that were given back, and the Reb Saadia Gaon says those are the utensils that were taken and that are referred to here in Sefer Daniel. So that's the miktzat, by the way. If you start thinking 5,400 is a miktzat, because if you remember at this time, and this is one of the things, there still were in Yirmiyahu and Perek Chav Zayin, he still talks at this time, he says, Ko Amar Hashem Tzfakot, El ha'amudim v'al hayam v'al ha'mechonot v'al yeter ha'kelim ha'notarim bir hazot, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is addressing the city of Yerushalayim through Yirmiyahu, and he's referring to those other utensils, the famous ones that we saw were dismantled and cut apart at the end of the Churban in the time of Tzidkiyahu, two Jewish kings later, including the Yam. Remember that massive basin that was supported by the 12 golden bronze oxen, and also the other the portable basins and all of the other kelim. Most of the things were still in the Beit HaMikdash, but Nebuchadnezzar had carried off enough that was the bribe for him. That's the approach, and that's what we're talking about miktzat, why it is just some of those things. And believe it or not, it says he brought them to Eretz Shinar. Now, interesting, the reason he's bringing these to Eretz Shinar, well, Beit Elohav. So Rashi says all of this is being done because he wants to praise, he wants to give thanks to his own gods. And so he takes the things from the Beit HaMikdash and he brings them to his gods. But what's a little interesting on this, and this, again, Reb Saadia Gaon has this issue, and he says, if you look at the Pasuk, it says he brought them Eretz Shinar Beit Elohav, he brings it to the temples of his gods, V'etakelim hevi Otzar Beit Elohav. And the utensils he brings to the treasury of his gods. It sounds like it's two separate things, but the same ultimate location. And so Saadia Gaon says, actually, the first time when it says Beit Elohav, it doesn't mean gods, but rather it means judges. So he brought the first, V'yivi'em Eretz Shinar Beit Elohav, he brought the captives to the courts, and the kelim he brought to the treasuries of his gods, which then seems to resolve why it has this Elohav twice. We do know it's talking about two subjects because the VM is referring to both Yoyakim, the captives, and the utensils. And so we divide it into two separate pieces. In that sense, we now have this idea as well to explain it. And we do have and Sefer Ezra and Perek, we talk about, there was a famous temple in the city of Bavel of Baal Merodach, which was the god that they worshipped, and that temple is most likely where he brought it to. By Yomer, we're now all the way up to Pasuk Gimel. By Yomer HaMelech le'Ashpenaz Rav Sarisav. And so Nebuchadnezzar tells Ashpenaz, who was the captain of the Sarisim, of the ministers. Again, if you remember, Sarisim is a subject. It is one of those words where sometimes it's taken literally and sometimes it's not. A Saris is a eunuch. The eunuchs were chosen for obvious reasons to be responsible for the king's harems. But as time goes on, we see that Sarisim also had alternative meanings. We have Saris Paro, okay, we talk about back in the Chumash. We have people who are ministers and have that same title. It's just the use of the language, and that's the simple piece of it. But the person, Ashpenaz, it could be that was his name. We don't find that name anywhere else. However, there is an opinion that Ashpenaz is actually from the Akkadian, which is the same meaning of Rav Sarisim. He gave them over to Ashpenaz, or the king tells Ashpenaz, what is Ashpenaz? It means Rav Sarisav, and that the Dat Mikra suggests. And he tells Ashpenaz, Mebnei Yisrael u'mizeram lucha u'mina partamim. He says, listen, he says, Lahavi, bring from the Bnei Yisrael. Now, who are the Bnei Yisrael? The Medrash Daniel, which is a fascinating book. The Medrash Daniel is one of a series that was written by Shmuel ben Nisim Masnut, who was an Aleppo Chacham in the 13th century. We don't know a lot about him, but what's fascinating about him is most of his works were not published until the 20th century. And so, for example, he has a commentary on Sefer Daniel that's called Medrash Shmuel that was only published in 1968. And until then, it was pretty inaccessible to us. He suggests specifically that this Bnei Yisrael means from the Jews who were not from Shevet Yehuda, meaning the northern Jews. And he wants, because he says that's in contradistinction to the Zera HaMlucha, to the royal families, which is from Shevet Yehuda, and Mina Partamim, and also from those who were the children of the ministers. Rashi says, Duchsim. Duchsim is the same word as we have in English of a duke, D-U-K-E. Okay, and the Duchsim, these were the ministers. That's the way the Medrash Shmuel understands it. Interestingly, Bibnei Yisrael, according to Reb Sajagon, is non-Levim, that he wants to have Jews who are not part of the priestly class. According to the Ralbag, he says, no, what happens is I want Jews, Bibnei Yisrael. And then he begins to distinguish or to delineate who are the Jews he wants from Zera Mlucha, and he wants to have also from the important officials. Yiladim, and specifically, he wants children, asher ein bahem kol mum. Now, if you notice, this word mum is spelled mem, aleph, vav, mem. Mum means blemish. And we'll see in here that we're looking for people who are not only of significant stock, but also have a certain bearing about them. So without blemish simply comes to mean that they have to look good. However, it's spelled mem, aleph, vav, mem, and therefore the Malbim says it's actually not just a physical blemish, but rather that there is nothing, there's not even a mu'umah, anything at all that, you know, that would in any way limit them or diminish them. What we would probably say now is do a thorough background check on everyone to make sure there's no skeletons in their closets. We want vitovei mar'eh. We want the ones who are very handsome. Umaskilim b'chol chokhmah. And we want them who are well educated in a wide range of knowledge. Okay, as Reb Sajagon says, and this is in the commentary that Reb Yosef Kapach had edited, he says that they already have, and this is his terminology, musagim b'chol hamada'im uzkukim rak li'ishtalmut, that they're very well educated in a, let's call it a liberal arts education, a liberal arts, and at the same time, what they need now is to have additional pieces. We don't want to take people who aren't well educated. V'yodei dat, we want people who are not just, as the Abarbanel says, the Ibn Ezra says, I'm sorry, that specifically, we want people who are one, that they understand. Dat means that they can understand when people are speaking, and they can read people's thoughts. Not that they're mind readers, but they understand, they see where people are coming from. They have that understanding for them. Umivinei dat. Oh, madam, and also the madam in this sense, it says the Mitzudat David that this is that they speak clearly. Okay, but also the Rambam says that Madai here is a sense of understand secrets. They understand things, the mysteries. Okay, and they can understand when people speak in roundabout fashion with parables and riddles. Vasher koach b'hem. Okay, and I want people who are powerful. Now, powerful, the Gemara in Sanhedrin and Daf Tzadik Gimel and Bet says that what they would do is these people would have to stand for hours on end, and they'd have to have the strength to stand, and they would even have to have the strength to withstand any natural urges they may have that would require them to step aside from them. They have to take care of themselves, and they have to have that power. They can't even take a bathroom break, explains the Gemara in Sanhedrin. They have to have that strength. And then, ulamdam sefer ulashon kastim. And that, not just that, they want sefer and lashon. Sajagon says, I want them to be able to understand written and spoken Babylonian. That this words of the language of the kastim. The Ralbag says that what I want from them, sefer lashon kastim, I want them to understand the royal protocols, the protocols of our company, of our country. Vayiman lahem hamelech devar yom biyomo mipat bag hamelech umiyen mishtav, and what the king will provide for them every day is he will provide for them from the pat bag. This is, Rashi says, this is from the royal table. He's going to provide for them food. Vayiman means that he'll make sure it's provided. You remember Vayiman Hashem Dag, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the whale, the fish, to swallow up Yonah. Same verb. And also from the royal wine, and it'll be provided each and every day. Yom biyomo. Interestingly, the Malbim says it wasn't the same menu. It's going to be every day. He'll get the same thing that the king is getting. And ulegadlam shanim shalosh. These people who are going to find, they're going to be reared for 3 years. Umitzatam yamdu lifnei hamelech. And then, after the end of 3 years, at that point, they're going to stand before the king. Just some of them will have the power to do so. Now, why is it 3 years? So the Gemara in Chulin says in Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph, Talmid shelo ra siman yafeh lemishnato gimel shanim shuv eino ro'eh. And if you're trying to learn something, and after 3 years you still don't get it, you're not going to get it anymore. 3 years is the period of time that education has a chance to kick in. And if it isn't kicking in, it's not going to work. So the king says, listen, these are the people. I want to have the people with the greatest potential. I'm going to provide for them everything they need. And at the end of the 3 years, let's see who makes the cut. Vayehi bahem mibnei Yehuda, and among, yes, was a question?
I was talking to Elaine.
Vayehi bahem mibnei Yehuda, and there were some among the people who came from Bnei Yehuda, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. There were 3 people, and their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, Mibnei Yehuda, the Ralbag says that this seems to be an exception to the Zera Melucha, to the monarchy, of the royal family, and it seems to be an exception to the Partamim, because here it's calling them Bnei Yehuda and not anything else. The Barbanel attacks the Ralbag's approach, and he says this makes no sense, because if they weren't part of that original request that the king had to Ashpenaz, then that means that Ashpenaz is bringing people against the royal order. And to do something like that is rebellious in nature. It's prohibited to do that. And so it must be that these were from the royal family. And that's exactly what the Abarbanel concludes, exactly what the Malbim concludes, the Risad Gon concludes, the Mitzvot David concludes, that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they were of the royal lineage. In fact, Rav Saadia Gaon says that these people were from Chizkiyahu's family, because Yeshayahu prophesied about Chizkiyahu, "Mibanecha asher tolid yikchu v'hayu sarisim be'echal melech Bavel," that your children, among your children, are going to be taken out into the exile, and they will serve as sarisim to the king of Bavel. Again, this is one of those things where we begin to question, was Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah just ministers ultimately, or were they eunuchs as well? And the Chazal are split on this. Vayasem lahem Sarah sarisim shemot, and they were given different names. Vayasem Daniel. Daniel was called Belshazzar. V'lechananiah Shadrach. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Ula Mishael Meshach. And Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah Aved-Nego. And Azariah was called Aved-Nego. Now, first of all, changing names is nothing new. We see this back in the time of Yosef, that he's known as Tzafnat Paneach. We also know that Yehoiakim, the king who was taken towards Bavel, he was renamed. His real name was Eliakim. So we're not really sure why this happened, but we know this happens. So again, in the Midrash Shmuel, he suggests that this was all a matter of giving them greater kavod. You want to give them greater honor, and you give them greater honor by giving them the names of royalty. And in that sense, Belshazzar, which was Daniel's name, and there's a major machloket, it could be the name of an idol. It could be as well, that's Rashi's approach. It could be about the king himself, Nebuchadnezzar. He says, Belshazzar, et chayei hamelech mitzor, protect the life of the king, is how you would translate it into from Babylonian. The Malbim says that this was, again, another idol name. But Sudot David says that it's actually just translation of the word Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, same kind of disagreement we have, that Shadrach may just be not idols, it may be a person who is still young. Meshach, it might be someone who sees. Avadnego, it may be the same thing as Avadnevo. Avadnego is the same thing, that he is a servant of the idol who is known as Nego. Our time is up, but
can I just mention one thing?
Yeah.
That perhaps also the changing of names is like the attempt to change a personality or an identity. So he's absolutely removing his identity and making him one of his
100%.
own.
And that would say that it's not for kavod necessarily. It may be to say you're mine.
Right.
Beautiful. And just to end on a little bit more of a fun
Positive.
note, if it's okay, knowing these three names, and I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. If you do recall, these three names were also very famous song by Louis Armstrong.
There was three children from the land of Israel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Took a trip to the land of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Took a lot of gold and made an idol, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he told everybody we'd hear the music of the trumpet. And he told everybody we'd hear the music of the flute. And he told everybody we'd hear the music of the horn. They must fall down and worship the idol, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. But the children.
And you can get the rest of that song on YouTube, but I figured I couldn't hold back. Louis Armstrong was a great singer. And it also apparently in the 1930s was not only a great song, made the charts, but again made the charts later in more recent times in newer versions as well. So if you ever want to remember the names of the three, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, just think Louis Armstrong. And of course, if you see the picture on the screen right now, we also know who that was as well. I will see everyone again next week. But before we conclude, can I just ask, I'm going to turn off the recording. Can I just